In my last WoW video, I explained why I'm optimistic about ranged mistweaving in Dragonflight, and after playing it through the first couple weeks of Season 1, I wanted to make a sort of guide, or at least an overview, of how the playstyle works, at least the way I play it. In short, it's an all-purpose, all-healing build that can be performed either in melee or at range, the only restriction being that you have to melee if you want some extra mana back during downtime. I'll leave a link to my build in the description, but it's also on screen. This build focuses on covering just about every major damage event with something, and then spending calmer moments just getting the most out of Renewing Mist, Vivify, and Enveloping Mist. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't set up with the intention of trying to parse, at least in larger raid sizes, but I do try and maintain good judgment, and I pride myself on keeping my overhealing percentage relatively low. For big healing events, especially the first one in each fight, I like to use Revival, just so I can get it on cooldown and start benefiting from uplifted spirits as soon as possible. If I know Revival isn't going to completely cover the first big hit, I'll cast Essence Font beforehand, as long as I know that that won't be needed for the next 30 seconds. That way it puts its hot on most of the raid, and then Revival triggers its mastery twice. But using Essence Font after the Revival is fine too, especially if there's enough damage left over for it to do some healing, like for Aranog's Incinerating Roar, which also leaves a dot on the raid. Since I spec into the 1 minute Yu'lon cooldown, for most damage events I'll cast it with Mana Tea, then cast Enveloping Mist on between 3 and 5 different players before casting Refreshing Jade Wind and Essence Font. All of that together does a ton of group healing, and with the Invoker's Delight talent you can squeeze just about all of that into the Mana Tea window. Sometimes I'll use all of this at the start of the fight if there's constant ticking damage, as long as I know that I won't need it for the first minute, like on Kurog where I know my Revival can cover the first big event all on its own. You just have to remember to conserve mana a bit afterward, or use a potion, which I normally do. For some fights, front-loading cooldowns like this can leave you looking or feeling irresponsible if you've got nothing for the second or third damage event. That's where I try and string a few things together. It's no Revival or Yu'lon, but if you string together all of your smaller cooldowns, that's Jade Wind, Chi Burst, and even a medium power Essence Font, you can usually get the raid through some pretty big damage and then top them off with a few casts of Vivify. On the topic of amping up your healing events in general, I put 2 points in Secret Infusion so I can guarantee 10 seconds of plus 15 crit. For me, triggering this before an Essence Font, and especially before a Revival, or right after casting Yu'lon, is crucial. However, there's certain situations, based on your stats, where you might want to use Thunder Focus Tea with Renewing Mist or Essence Font instead, for haste. That's because 15% haste can be the difference between covering 2 events with Refreshing Jade Wind, or just 1, since its cooldown and duration are both affected by haste. This is how I make sure to have Refreshing Jade Wind up for the first 2 Hurricane Wings on Raszageth in the first phase, since it wouldn't have been up for the second one without a bit of temporary haste. The next thing I want to go over is Vivacious Vivification. I'm sure there's a better weak-ore out there for tracking the proc from this talent, since it's tragically wasted if you're already casting Vivify when it procs. But what I do when I want to try and play around it is I'll cast Enveloping Mist on 1 or 2 people between procs, so that I can follow it up with a Vivify as soon as it comes. I do this more in dungeons than raids, but it works in both settings, as long as you have the mana to support it. When it comes to downtime, or any time between major damage events, I like to keep my Renewing Mists active, weaving in the occasional Enveloping Mist on hurt players if I know I can follow it up with a Vivify for the extra cleave target, since Rapid Diffusion causes it to create another Renewing Mist for 6 seconds whenever I cast Enveloping. If there's absolutely no healing to be done, or if I think my mana's just not going to last the fight, I'll triple palm Blackout Kick for mana through Spirit of the Crane. I'll throw in a Rising Sun Kick if I know I'll get use out of the 6-second Renewing Mist that it creates. Otherwise, I usually don't bother, since that's 6250 mana I could spend elsewhere. Now, if you ask me, the build's biggest weakness in raids is that the long Essence Font channel leaves you unable to spot heal if you need to, unless you're okay with losing a ton of healing by canceling it early. I noticed this on fights like Sinarth, where the tanks are getting blasted hard between platforms and need a ton of focused healing. That's why I try and make sure everyone's stable before I commit to a fully upwelled Essence Font, which I can supplement by cocooning the tank, or simply topping people off before it's ready. The other weakness, obviously, is that this playstyle does almost no damage, so if you're raiding at an early cutting edge level, or with a group that expects you to do DPS, this might be a deal breaker. I've never had an issue with this personally. The group I raid with usually makes it a third, maybe halfway through Mythic by the end of each tier. And if you're not on the bleeding edge of progression, chances are you're wiping due to botched mechanics and early avoidable deaths. But that's just my experience, so take it with a grain of salt. Before I close this out, one notable mention is Escape from Reality, a talent that turns Transcendence into powerful throughput and mana conservation. If used optimally, this could allow you to cast more powerful Vivifies at half cost for 10 out of every 45 seconds, if we were being incredibly optimistic. Weaving this into the rest of the healing rotation in a way that responds to damage patterns is really tricky, so I haven't gotten much use out of it yet. But in terms of improving my playstyle in the long term, that's probably going to be a significant part of it. The other notable mention is Bone Dust Brew, which is a lot like Secret Infusion in that it's frequently available as an amplifier to healing in general, especially if you can hit a bunch of people with it just before Revival or Essence Font or something big. Even in dungeons, it's helped me to heal through some pretty catastrophic damage, and it's also nice on big trash packs for getting a lot of DPS out of Spinning Crane Kick. The reason I'm not covering Bone Dust Brew in such detail is because it's going away soon, and being replaced by Sheilun's Gift. I can faintly remember Sheilun's being a powerful single-target heal back in Legion, but based on this preview of its reincarnation in Dragonflight, my hope is that it's a mana-friendly filler that does as much healing as a Vivify or two. We'll have to see how long of a cooldown it ends up with, what the mana cost is like, and just how much healing it's actually going to do. Veil of Pride sounds like a solid boost to our throughput in general, with Despair and Anger being the ideal lessons to proc, and the other two being less of a pit for our flow. Based on the magnitude and abruptness of changes that we've suffered as Mistweavers throughout beta, I think I'll wait and see how they butcher the tuning on this before I get too optimistic. So with that, that's my guide to ranged mistweaving in raids, or at least what works for me. Information on ranged mistweaving tends to be less common, so I tried to address all the things I'd want to know if I was just starting out. Hopefully I did. Should I make a separate video talking about ranged mistweaving for Dungeons and Mythic Plus? Let me know in the comments. I think it's a more frowned upon playstyle for Dungeons than in raids, at least by the general community, but it absolutely works, and I could probably put together something similar to this video if it's useful. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I hope you're really enjoying Mistweaver and Dragonflight as much as I am. Until next time, happy holidays, and have a good one!